President is very satisfied that the international community agrees with him about the threat that Saddam Hussein presents. The international community and many of these nations that we are working most closely with see it the same way the President does. They too don't want war. They believe war should be a last resort, and they hope that Saddam Hussein will disarm so it can be averted, but make no mistake that the work of assembling a coalition continues. President Bush has said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Tony Blair has said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Donald Rumsfeld has said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction. Richard Butler has said they do. The United Nations has said they do. The experts have said they do. Iraq says they don't. You can choose who you want to believe.
And it was all for a pack of lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction.
Thank you very much. My name is Glenn Diesen. We agreed today I should probably speak in English. I'm Norwegian, but I lived abroad for about 20 years, mostly Australia and Russia and Netherlands. So my Norwegian is quite awful, which makes my Swedish even worse. So we're going to go with English. So I'm a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway, and I focus mostly on Russian foreign policy. I've written 11 books, most of them about the conflicting relationship between Russia and the West in terms of our inability to establish or develop a mutually acceptable security architecture after the Cold War. And since 2015, I've been mostly working on Russia's cooperation with China, India, other countries in the East, in which they're looking to diversify their economic connectivity to make themselves less dependent on Western economies. So effectively what we've been seeing over the past 2 years now. But the topic for today was, the name of my speech was NATO's war on Ukraine. The main purpose here is not to provoke, or maybe a little bit, but the purpose is mainly then to challenge a key aspect of the war narrative which we have developed. Because we see whenever NATO escalates, sends some more advanced weaponry, rejects any diplomacy, we always hear the same argument. Why would NATO do this? And it's always because, well, we're pro-Ukrainian. We help Ukraine. So this is really at the core of the argument that NATO is simply, it's not even a participant. It's just seeking to help Ukraine out of our altruistic and good nature. And my argument is this is very propagandistic because we have taken a concept or even a sentiment, the idea to help Ukraine or to be pro-Ukrainian, which everyone agrees would appeal to the best in people. And again, who doesn't want to help Ukraine? What's happening to the country now is gruesome. We see a whole people being slaughtered, a nation being destroyed. I would certainly like to help Ukraine. But to help Ukraine as a concept is a very empty concept, and it can be filled with any content you want. And this is how propaganda often works. You come with a concept everyone agrees with, and then you fill it in with a bunch of nonsense, which often contradicts this concept altogether. So when NATO commits a lot of crimes against Ukraine, and it tends to organize it under this concept of only helping and being pro-Ukrainian. So today, I would like to unpack some of this concept, what it means to actually help Ukraine. And we can start at the beginning, because this war largely revolves around NATO expansion. This is what provoked the Russian invasion. NATO presents itself very much as a passive actor. It merely is responding to Ukraine's desire to join NATO, to join the free world, and thereby escape this imperial clutches of Russia. The problem is that there's no facts to back this up. We see every single poll, be it Ukrainian, Western, Russian, from 1991 to 2014, every single poll showed that merely about 20% of Ukrainians wanted to join NATO. Even after Russia took back Crimea in 2014, the Americans did another poll, and they found out there was still only a tiny minority of Ukrainians who wanted to join NATO. So a bigger conflict would then be required. Even NATO in 2011, they had a document coming out where they complained that the main problem in relationship between Ukraine and NATO was that the government and the people didn't want to join. So this is why it's a bit of a flawed argument. And not only this, we also knew the consequences of what would it mean if Ukraine tried to join NATO. This is being Angela Merkel. She once said that this would be interpreted as a declaration of war. We had the former British ambassador to Russia saying that this would be the best way to start a war with Russia is to try to get Ukraine into NATO. And lastly, the current director of the CIA, which is William Burns, he wrote a memo back in 2008 when he made the argument that if we try to get Ukraine into NATO, which they don't want, but if we try to get them in, it will likely trigger a civil war and also a Russian invasion. Now, he made the point that the Russians didn't want to invade, but they couldn't live with NATO inside Ukraine, so they would see it as having no other choice. Again, what we refer today as Russian propaganda. This is very much already confirmed. But we still sold this as helping Ukraine, pull them in to a military alliance they didn't want to be a part of and which would trigger a war. But nonetheless, in 2014, NATO promoted then a regime change in Ukraine. This happened very much in the open, as most people have listened in on the leaked calls in which the Americans 2 weeks before the coup planned exactly who would be inside the government, who should stay outside. And this was also sold as helping Ukraine. We were helping them with a democratic revolution. But again, how did we help them with our pro-Ukrainian policies? Because the facts, also reported by Western media, be it BBC or others, they proved that not only was this in breach of the Ukrainian constitution, not only did we remove their democratically elected government, which the OSCE had confirmed was elected in a free election, but it also, as BBC reported, only a minority of Ukrainians actually supported the protests on Maidan. An even smaller minority would have supported an actual coup toppling their democratically elected government. So they removed this democratically elected government and in its place put a government handpicked by the United States. And this is also sold to us, again, as being pro-Ukrainian and helping Ukraine. At the time, I was teaching in Australia, and I warned we should not. This coup is a huge mistake. It will eventually trigger a war with Russia. Not a very original idea. I'm just listening to the CIA director Burns. And I was told this is a pro-Russian argument, and it's anti-Ukrainian. Certainly, if we're pro-Ukrainian, we push through this coup. And then we saw on the first day after the coup, again, this is reported by the New York Times a few months ago, 3 months ago. They report on the first day after the coup, the government handpicked by the United States, the intelligence chief of the new Ukrainian government, the first thing he did on the first day was to call CIA and MI6 for a covert war against Russia. So a partnership between the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the British. And this resulted in many CIA bases across the Russian border. And this was, by the way, on the first day they made this call. This was before Russia took back Crimea or Donbass was destabilized. And again, if we read the same New York Times article, they frame this as making or converting Ukraine into a frontline state in a proxy war, that this was, again, a pro-Ukrainian argument, a position. We're simply helping Ukraine. And as William Burns, the CIA director, predicted, you immediately had instability because, very predictably, in the East, there was hardly any at all who would support the legitimacy of the new government. So, what happened? Well, the United States, they supported the use of nationalists instead, because it turned out that the new government in Kyiv, they couldn't really get Ukrainians to go down and kill their own citizens because, well, they didn't want to. So the United States became reliant on nationalist movements, fascist groups. and sent them down to fight against Donbass, and killing over the next few years 14,000 Ukrainians who then died in Donbass. Now, they called this an anti-terrorist operation, and this was also then to help Ukraine, apparently to fight terrorism. And thereafter, we wanted to help Ukrainians a little bit more with good governance, because they were not capable of apparently governing themselves. And the United States began to seize control over key positions in the Ukrainian government. The general prosecutor of Ukraine, Viktor Shokin, he made a complaint. He said that all the new appointments in the United States, all the top positions, had to be approved by Washington. And he argued that, and this is his words, that Washington was treating Ukraine as a colony. He was also, by the way, fired by Joe Biden, again, president of another country, because he was investigating the corruption in a Ukrainian gas company where he put his own son to work, Hunter Biden. But he also had some very obvious problems. For example, the new finance minister of Ukraine, it had to be an American. The former US State Department official, Natalia Yaresco, she actually worked at the US Embassy in Kiev, representing American interests in Ukraine. After the coup, she took the position as the finance minister of Ukraine, and she got her Ukrainian passport on the very same day. So this is the kind of positions, and this was not the only ones. He also had a lot of other foreigners taking key positions in the Ukrainian government, and even the positions which had to be filled by Ukrainians, the Americans had to prove these positions. We also saw the United States mobilizing and arming and training a lot of nationalist groups, such as the Azov Battalion, who uses fascist symbols on their emblem. They also purged the political opposition. The main political opposition parties, the main opposition leader, Medvedchuk, he was arrested, and they took away his Ukrainian passport and citizenship. They purged the media, which had to be put under the control of the state, but mainly what was considered the pro-Russian media, even though it was owned by Ukrainians and being in Ukraine. They also had to purge the Orthodox Church and basic cultural rights like language rights. And all of this was done in the name of helping Ukraine, because Russian influence was an imperial legacy which had to be purged. So this was all done, again, in the name of helping Ukraine. So this is considered to be a pro-Ukrainian policy. And if you post it, that they should have these basic rights in Ukraine, then you would be labeled as pro-Russian instead, or anti-Ukrainian. Next in line, we had the election coming up in Ukraine in 2019. So the Ukrainians had a chance to vote again, and you had Zelensky running, and he ran on a peace platform. He had a very clear message. He wanted to make peace with Donbass, make peace with Russia, and this meant implementing the Minsk agreement. He was making speeches very clearly that if people in Donbass wants to speak Russian, which they have always done, then they should be allowed to do so. But the United States, again, came for the rescue. They argued that this meant to capitulate to Russia, and the Ukrainians should not have to capitulate, despite 73% of Ukrainians voting for it. So again, US-trained and armed nationalists put immense pressure on Zelensky. They even threatened him in the open, in front of cameras. Not very well covered by our media, but in the Ukrainian media it was covered. And as a result, Zelensky eventually reversed his position, and right-wing leaders who had threatened to hang him from a tree and kill him, they were given top positions in his government. So again, the Americans could use these nationalist groups as a veto power. Also strengthening a very unsavory group then within Ukraine, which most Ukrainians would not actually support. So the Minsk agreement was then undermined, even though all the Western leaders kept saying that this was the only path to peace. Even the French and the Germans acknowledged that they had undermined this agreement, that it wasn't meant to be implemented, it was just buy time to arm Ukraine. Again, not what the Ukrainians had voted for, but again, it's to help Ukraine, a pro-Ukrainian policy. And then, sorry, no, still have some time. Russia demanded then some security guarantees in 2021, as we remember, because they saw this threat becoming growing, and it's becoming more and more intolerable. Even the Americans, they acknowledged that if the Russians wouldn't get security guarantees, they would probably invade Ukraine. And yet again, they rejected giving Russia any security guarantees. The US former ambassador to NATO, and who was also part of the Donbass team to resolve the crisis, he even warned Biden that when he was meeting with Putin for the security guarantees, he wrote that that success is confrontation. We should not want to make any peace with the Russians. That's appeasement. Instead, we want confrontation. And again, this is when Russia invaded as well in 2022. And yes, Ola spoke briefly about this. This was the main objective of Russia then, was to get an end to this war. To restore Ukrainian neutrality. And this was also confirmed by the Ukrainians on the first day of the invasion. They said, they made it very clear on the first day that the Russians had contacted them. This is Zelensky's words, on the first day after they invaded, because they wanted to start peace talks already. And the main peace talks would be based on restoring neutrality. And on the third day, the Russians and the Ukrainians had agreed they're going to start having peace negotiations. When the American spokesperson, Ned Price, was asked, will you support these peace negotiations? He said very clearly, well, this war isn't really just about Ukraine. It's about something much greater. So no, we will not. And even though the Ukrainians and Russians still began to negotiate, we saw then that the US and the UK, they pressured Zelensky to choose war instead. This has been confirmed by the negotiators on the Ukrainian side, the advisor of Zelensky, the head of Zelensky's own political party, the mediators who mediated the talks, the Israelis and the Turks, they all confirmed it. And as Ola spoke about as well, the former head of the German army, Harald Kuyat, he also confirmed this, that the Ukrainians and the Russians had pretty much come to an agreement. The main thing was neutrality, and the Americans said no. And as all of this, the Turks, Israelis, the German head of the German army, former head of the German army, all stated, this was seen by the British and the Americans as an opportunity, because now they could kill Russians and weaken Russia as an adversary, and they didn't even have to fight with their own troops. By the way, this is something that's also been confirmed or stated very openly by American leaders, be it Lindsey Graham, Mitch McConnell, Mitt Romney, you had Dan Crenshaw, General Kellogg, even the NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg, when he went to sell the war in America, that they should send more weapons and money, he made a point that this is a good deal. For very little money, you get to weaken the Russians as a strategic adversary. And much like all the American leaders, he didn't really mention the Ukrainians who are fighting for us. And this is part of the problem, because we're fighting with Ukrainians. We're not fighting with our own soldiers. So there's very little incentive here to actually make a peace with the Russians. But again, we're still selling this as we're helping the Ukrainians. That's why we're sending weapons, and also that's why we're refusing to negotiate. And even the Washington Post reported in 2023 that the Ukrainian military didn't really want to go on the horrible counteroffensive in the summer of 23, exactly because they were losing so many men. Tens of thousands of men died. All this equipment was being destroyed. As the Washington Post reported, they spoke with American military leaders as well, and they said the Ukrainians were too casualty averse. They're too afraid that all their men are dying. The Americans did not have this problem. Again, as Lindsey Graham said, they had a great deal. Zelensky promised to send, if the Americans promised to send more weapons, Zelensky had promised he would fight to the last man. Again, this is the last man, the last Ukrainian, also confirmed by Graham. And also, why did we pressure the Ukrainians to do an offensive, which they didn't want to do? Well, we want to help them. Again, help them get their country back. So, yes, a final remark. This is the main problem. We see now also that Ukraine is losing. This is a war of attrition. Every day they're losing scores of men. They're losing all their military equipment. They're losing their land, and the country is being destroyed. And yet, we're not talking about even negotiating with the Russians. We can offer some things. We can offer an end to NATO expansion. That would be a huge bargaining chip if we want to get a good deal from the Russians, but we don't. Instead, we're talking about how about we start expelling Ukrainian civilians from Poland or Germany. If we just stop giving them social benefits, they have to go home. And then we can fill up the trenches with more men who don't want to fight. So this is all being done again under this umbrella of trying to help Ukraine. So that's my main point. I think there's a difference between hating Russia and loving the Ukrainians. And if we're willing to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainians, I don't think it's based on anything to do about being pro-Ukrainian or helping the Ukrainians. It's more about targeting the Russians. And as all the American leaders keep saying all the time, this is what the war is about. We get to knock out the Russians and focus all our resources on the Chinese. So again, I think this should be the point of departure when we discuss the war in Ukraine. It's not about helping anyone. It's about using Ukraine in a very cynical game of great power politics. So, thank you.
John Mearsheimer is the Roland Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago, an institution where he's taught for nearly 4 decades. Prior to that, he graduated from the US Military Academy in West Point, after which he joined the Air Force, and then took a PhD in political science at Cornell University. Now, for those of you with a background in international relations theory, Mearsheimer is a household name. He is without a doubt one of the towering figures of the discipline, and probably the most prominent representative of the realist school of international politics.
The war in Ukraine is a multi-dimensional disaster, which is likely to get worse in the foreseeable future. When a war is successful, little attention is paid to its causes, but when the outcome is disastrous, much attention is paid to the origins of the conflict. People want to know, how did we get into this terrible situation? I have witnessed this phenomenon twice in my lifetime. First with the Vietnam War, and second with the Iraq War. In both cases, Americans wanted to know, how did their country miscalculate so badly? Given that the United States and its NATO allies played a crucial role in the events that led to the Ukraine war, and are now playing a central role in the conduct of that war, it's appropriate to evaluate the West's responsibility for this calamity. I want to make 2 main arguments today. First, the United States is principally responsible for causing the Ukraine crisis. This is not to deny that Putin started the war and that he is responsible for Russia's conduct on the battlefield. Nor is it to deny that America's allies bear some responsibility, but they largely follow Washington's lead on Ukraine. My key point, however, is that the United States pushed forward policies toward Ukraine that Putin and his colleagues see as an existential threat to their country, a point they have made repeatedly for many years. Specifically, I am talking about America's obsession with bringing Ukraine into NATO and making it a Western bulwark on Russia's border. The Biden administration was unwilling to eliminate that threat through diplomacy and indeed recommitted itself to bringing Ukraine into NATO during 2021. Putin responded by invading Ukraine on February 24th of this year. Second, the Biden administration has reacted to the outbreak of the war by doubling down against Russia. Washington and its Western allies are committed to decisively defeating Russia in Ukraine and employing comprehensive sanctions to greatly weaken Russian power. The United States is not seriously interested in finding a diplomatic solution to the war. which means the war is likely to drag on for months, if not years. In the process, Ukraine, which has already suffered grievously, is going to experience even greater harm. In essence, the United States and its allies are helping lead Ukraine down the primrose path. Furthermore, there's a danger that the war will escalate as NATO might get dragged into the fighting and nuclear weapons might be used. We live in perilous times. Let me now turn to the real cause of the Ukraine crisis and ultimately the Ukraine war. The taproot is the American-led effort to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders. That strategy has three prongs. One, integrating Ukraine into the EU. Two, turning Ukraine into a pro-Western liberal democracy. You all know about the Orange Revolution. And three, and most importantly, incorporating Ukraine into NATO. The strategy was set in motion at NATO's annual summit in Bucharest in April 2008, when the alliance announced that Ukraine and Georgia will become members. That's in quotes, will become members. Russian leaders responded immediately with outrage, making it clear that this decision was an existential threat to Russia, and they had no intention of letting either country join NATO. According to a respected Russian journalist, Putin, quote, flew into a rage and warned that if Ukraine joins NATO, it will do so without Crimea and the eastern regions. It will simply fall apart. That's Putin talking in 2008. William Burns, who is now the head of the CIA, was then the U.S. ambassador to Moscow. This is at the time of the Bucharest summit. He wrote a memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice that succinctly describes Russian thinking about Ukraine joining NATO. And you want to pay very careful attention to what Burns said, and then what I'm going to tell you Angela Merkel has recently said. This is Burns. This is his memo. He's the U.S. ambassador in Moscow. It's his memo to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. NATO, he said, would be seen as throwing down the strategic gauntlet. Today's Russia will respond. Russian-Ukrainian relations will go into a deep freeze. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine. Burns, of course, was not the only policymaker who understood that bringing Ukraine into NATO was fraught with danger. Indeed, at the Bucharest summit, at the summit itself, both German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Nicolas Sarkozy were opposed to moving forward on NATO membership for Ukraine because they feared it would infuriate Russia. Angela Merkel recently explained her opposition in an interview. I'm quoting Angela Merkel, I was very sure that Putin is not going to let this happen. From his perspective, that would be a declaration of war. Think about what Merkel, who opposed it in April 2008, is saying. She's saying that she knew that Putin would interpret it as a declaration of war. In other words, putting Ukraine in NATO would be a declaration of war. And Burns has just told you that Putin's not an anomaly, that every Russian member of the foreign policy elite, including the knuckle draggers in the recesses of the Kremlin that he has talked to, view it just as Putin views it. The Bush administration, which was pushing this policy decision for NATO, however, cared little about Moscow's brightest of red lines and pressured the French and German leaders to agree to issuing a public pronouncement that said unequivocally that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Unsurprisingly, the American-led effort to integrate Georgia into NATO resulted in a war between Georgia and Russia in August 2008, just 4 months after the Bucharest summit. Nevertheless, in the wake of that war, the United States and its allies continued moving forward with their plans to make Ukraine a Western bastion on Russia's borders. These efforts eventually sparked a major crisis in February of 2014, after a US-supported uprising caused Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, to flee the country. He was replaced by pro-American Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk. In response, Russia took Crimea from Ukraine and helped fuel a civil war that broke out in the Donbass between pro-Russian separatists and the Ukrainian government. One often hears the argument, I'm sure you've all heard this, that in the 8 years between when the crisis broke out in February 2014 and when the war began in February 2022. You see that 8-year window there? Just to keep the big picture in your mind. August 2008, that's the Bucharest summit. But the crisis doesn't break out until February 2014. And then the war breaks out 8 years later, February 2022. The argument is that in the 8 years between when the crisis broke out and when the war broke out, this past February, the United States and its allies paid little attention to bringing Ukraine into NATO. In effect, the issue had been taken off the table, and thus NATO enlargement could not possibly have been an important cause of the escalating crisis in 2021 and the subsequent outbreak of war earlier this year. This line of argument is false. In fact, the Western response to the events of 2014 was to double down on the existing strategy and effectively make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO. The alliance began training the Ukrainian military in 2014, averaging 10,000 trained troops annually over the next 8 years. NATO was training 10,000 troops per year for 8 straight years. In December 2017, the Trump administration decided to provide Kyiv with defensive weapons. Other NATO countries quickly got into the act, shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine's military participated in joint military exercises with NATO forces. In July 2021, less than a year ago, Kyiv and Washington co-hosted Operation Seabreeze, a naval exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries and was directly aimed at Russia. 2 months later, in September 2021, the Ukraine Army led Rapid Trident 21, which was, according to an official press release from the U.S. Army, it was, quote, a U.S. Army Europe and Africa-assisted annual exercise designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations. Remember, I'm making the argument here we were turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. It was designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations, to demonstrate units are poised and ready to respond to any crisis. NATO's efforts to arm and train Ukraine's military explains in good part why it has fared so well against Russian forces in the ongoing war. It's not simply Russian incompetence, it's the fact that we armed and trained those Ukrainian forces and turned them into a formidable fighting force. A headline in a recent issue of the Wall Street Journal put it quite nicely. This is quoting that headline in the Wall Street Journal. The secret of Ukraine's military success, years of NATO training. Years of NATO training. In addition to NATO's ongoing efforts to make the Ukrainian military a formidable fighting force, the politics surrounding Ukraine's membership in NATO and its integration into the West changed in 2021. There was renewed enthusiasm for pursuing Ukrainian membership in NATO in 2021. And the change took place in both Kyiv and in Washington. Let me start by telling you what happened in Kyiv. President Zelensky, who had never shown much enthusiasm for bringing Ukraine into NATO, and who was elected in March 2019 on a platform that called for working with Russia to settle the ongoing crisis, reversed course in early 2021 and not only embraced NATO expansion, but also adopted a hardline approach toward Moscow. He made a series of moves like shutting down pro-Russian TV shows and stations and arresting an especially close friend of Putin and charging him with treason. These were all moves that were sure to anger Moscow. President Biden, who moved into the White House in January 2021, Biden is moving into the White House just as Zelensky is beginning to do a flip on his views towards Ukraine and towards Russia. President Biden had long been committed to bringing Ukraine into NATO and was also super hawkish towards Russia. And you want to remember that when he was vice president in the Obama administration, President Obama assigned him, Joe Biden, with the Ukraine portfolio. So he was no stranger to this issue. Unsurprisingly, on June 14th, 2021, about a year ago, almost a year ago to the day, NATO issued the following communique at its annual Brussels summit. I'm going to quote, we reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, as an integral part of the process. We reaffirm all elements of that decision. We reaffirm all elements of that decision, as well as subsequent decisions, including that each partner will be judged on its own merits. We stand firm in our support for Ukraine's right to decide its own future and foreign policy course, free from outside interference. On September 1st, 2021, Zelensky visited the White House, where Biden made it clear in his public statements that the United States was, quote, firmly committed to Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. Then, on November 10th, 2021, Secretary of State Tony Blinken and his Ukrainian counterpart signed an important document. It's called the U.S.-Ukraine Charter on Strategic Partnership. It's available on the website or on the internet if you're interested. This is what it says. The aim of both parties is to, quote, underscore a commitment to Ukraine's implementation of the deep and comprehensive reforms necessary for full integration into Europe and Euro-Atlantic institutions. That document explicitly builds not just on, quote, the commitments made to strengthen the Ukraine-U.S. strategic partnership by Presidents Zelensky and Biden, end of quotes, but it also reaffirms the U.S. commitment to the, quote, 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration. In short, there is little doubt that starting in early 2021, Ukraine began moving rapidly toward joining NATO. Some argue that while that may be true, it should not have concerned Russian policymakers. We have decided it shouldn't have concerned Russian policymakers. Why? Because NATO is a defensive alliance and poses no threat to Russia. But that's not how Putin and other Russian leaders think about NATO. And it is what they think, not what you think or I think, that matters. And they see NATO as a direct threat. They see NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. They see it as the brightest of red lines. To deal with this growing threat, Putin stationed ever-increasing numbers of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders between February 2021 and February 2022. You remember last year? The number of Russian troops on Ukraine's borders continually increased and increased and increased. You ask yourself, why was that happening? It was happening in response to what Zelensky and Biden were doing, and all the arming and training was taking place. You noticed all those military exercises I described took place in 2021. Putin's aim was to coerce Biden and Zelensky into altering course and putting an end to their efforts to integrate Ukraine into the West. On December 17th, 2021, the Russians reached the boiling point, and Moscow sent separate letters to NATO and to Biden. Many of you, I'm sure, remember when the Russians sent those letters to Biden and to NATO, demanding a written guarantee that, number one, Ukraine would not join NATO, no offensive weapons would be stationed near Russia's borders, and three, NATO troops and equipment moved into Eastern Europe since 1997 would be moved back to Western Europe. Putin made numerous public statements during this period that left no doubt that he viewed NATO expansion into Ukraine as an existential threat. Speaking to the Defense Ministry Board on December 21st, 2021, he stated, this is quoting Putin, "What they are doing or trying or planning to do in Ukraine is not happening thousands of kilometers away from our national border. It's on the doorstep of our house. They must understand that we simply have nowhere further to retreat to. Do they really think we do not see these threats? Or do they think that we will just stand idly by watching threats to Russia emerge?" 2 months later, at a press conference on February 22nd, 2022, this is 2 days before they invade, Putin said, quote, "We are categorically opposed to Ukraine joining NATO because this poses a threat to us, and we have arguments to support this. I have repeatedly spoken about it in this hall." He then made it clear that he recognized that Ukraine was becoming a de facto member of NATO. The United States and its allies, he said, quote, "continue to pump the current Kiev authorities full of modern types of weapons," end of quote. He went on to say that if this was not stopped, Moscow, quote, "would be left with an anti-Russia armed to the teeth. This is totally unacceptable." Putin's logic should be manifestly clear to Americans in the audience who have long understood, I'm sure, that we have a Monroe Doctrine which stipulates that no great power is allowed to place any of its military forces in the Western Hemisphere. I might note that in all of Putin's public statements during the months leading up to the war, there is not a scintilla of evidence that he was contemplating conquering Ukraine and making it part of Russia, much less attacking other countries in Eastern Europe. Other Russian leaders, including the defense minister, the foreign minister, the deputy foreign minister, and the Russian ambassador to Washington, the Russian ambassador to Washington, also emphasized the centrality of NATO expansion for causing the Ukraine crisis. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov made the point succinctly at a press conference on January 14th, 2022, when he said, "The key to everything," I'm quoting Lavrov now, "the key to everything is the guarantee that NATO will not expand eastward." Nevertheless, the efforts of Lavrov and Putin to get the United States and its allies to abandon their efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border failed completely. Secretary of State Tony Blinken responded to Russia's mid-December demands by simply saying, quote, "There is no change, there will be no change." Putin then launched an invasion of Ukraine to eliminate the threat he saw from NATO.
Ambassador Freeman, thank you for being with us. We are all ears, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Paul, both for having me here and for the very thoughtful introduction. I'm going to go right into this. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I wish your cause well. It's been a while since the United States won a war, and it looks as though we're about to lose yet another one, the war in Ukraine. This is a proxy war justified as an effort to, quote, "weaken and isolate Russia." Our strategic defeat in this effort now leaves us with three unpalatable alternatives. We can continue to support Ukraine as Russia grinds it to bits and reduces it further in size and population. We can escalate the war, as French President Emmanuel Macron has advocated, despite the Russian threat to answer this with counter-escalation, possibly to the nuclear level. Or we can face up to failure and save what we can of Ukraine by negotiating with Russia. I know which of these choices I'd prefer, and I suspect you do too. And however this unwise and unnecessary war ends, we need to ensure that there are no more like it in future. They say that a mistake is only a mistake if you don't learn from it. Our country's recently made a lot of mistakes in its foreign policies, but sadly, we don't seem to be learning much of anything from these experiences. We have instead invented something uniquely American called a forever war. Such wars routinely fail, yet we keep launching them. I want to speak to you this evening about why we do this, why we shouldn't, and how we can stop doing it. My focus will be the forever war with Russia in Ukraine. Forever wars can take many forms. They can be economic or technological, like the one the Trump administration kicked off against China, and that the Biden administration has enthusiastically doubled down on. They can be military, like our 23-year global war on terrorism. That's taken us into combat in over 80 countries, killed over 900,000 people, and cost us an estimated $8 trillion. Forever wars need not be direct, as our proxy war in Ukraine illustrates. They can even be covert, as our multiple barely concealed interventions in Syria demonstrate. What America's forever wars have in common is that they involve muddled, open-ended objectives, movable goalposts, an intensely propagandized narrative to mobilize support for them, no quarter for those who challenge that narrative, no benchmarks for judging success or failure, no limits to the level of resources we must commit to them, no defined end state that would justify ending them, no strategy for their termination, and no vision of a feasible order if and when they actually end. Sun Tzu, argued that wars should implement strategies that achieve specific national objectives with the least destruction. Karl von Clausewitz described war as the expedient continuation of politics by other means. William Tecumseh Sherman said that the purpose of war was to produce a better peace. Freddie Clay said every war must end. But what if domestic political dysfunction prevents the definition of specific national objectives? What if a country's political culture dictates that the only effective way to impose its druthers on other countries is coercively through warfare, economic or military? What if such a country measures the success of punitive measures not by the extent to which they achieve desirable changes in foreign behavior, but by the pain they inflict on those foreigners? What if such a country believes it can resort to the use of force with impunity whenever it judges that less violent methods of bending foreigners to its will are less likely to do so? What if that country's wars routinely lead not to peace, but to turmoil or anarchy? Our forever wars are the product of applying hubris to two related national ambitions vis-a-vis the world beyond our borders. One, the consolation of a global American sphere of influence. And two, the foreign regime changes needed to realize this. The Ukraine war exemplifies both elements of this hegemonic behavior. It has been accompanied by wall-to-wall propaganda that confuses self-righteousness with truth, demonizes our adversary, and replaces analysis with wishful thinking and denial, leaving nothing certain and everything plausible. As always, the most destructive lies are those we tell ourselves. The Ukraine war is not, as is claimed, about democracy versus authoritarianism. It is about delineating the post-Cold War U.S. sphere of influence in Europe. Our country invented the modern concept of the sphere of influence. In the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary to it, we asserted a right to limit the freedom of maneuver of the countries of the Western Hemisphere and to demand their deference to our political and economic interests. After World War II, Americans expanded our sphere of influence to include Western Europe and Northeast Asia. In the post-Cold War period, Washington adapted the hegemonic principles of the Monroe Doctrine to the so-called unipolar moment and extended our sphere of influence to the entire world beyond the borders of Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. In the end, the only countries bordering Russia other than those of Central Asia not in our sphere of influence were Georgia and Ukraine. American neoconservatives saw these neighbors of Russia as vacuums to be filled by U.S. military power. During the Cold War, NATO was a purely defensive alliance that very effectively protected Western Europe from a predatory Soviet Union and its restive satellites. But 25 years ago, at the end of the 20th century, after the USSR had disappeared, NATO began to launch offensive operations. First against Serbia, then in Afghanistan, then and later in Libya. And as NATO expanded toward Russia's borders, American troops and weapons aimed at Russia routinely established a presence on the territory of NATO's new members. At the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Russian President Vladimir Putin bluntly warned the United States and its European allies that his country would feel obliged to act if NATO, the instrument by which the US has long exercised dominant political military influence in Europe, were further expanded. His warning echoed that of his predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, as early as 1994. In 2008, as in 1994, Washington ignored these warnings and persuaded NATO to offer membership to Georgia and Ukraine, both of which border the Russian Federation. As the Russians have a habit of saying, it was no accident that shortly thereafter war broke out between Georgia and Russia. This was in part due to Georgia's exuberant reaction to apparent open-ended American support for its nationalist objectives. But more to the point, it was a calculated Russian signal of resolve to resist encirclement by the United States and NATO. We dismissed the signal and portrayed Moscow's defeat of Georgian adventurism as wanton Russian aggression that vindicated our determination to bring Russia's neighbors into NATO. Someone summed this up at the time by declaring that the reason NATO still exists is to handle the problems that NATO's continuing existence creates. Coincident with the war in Georgia, the United States and NATO escalated the effort to re-equip, restructure, and retrain the Ukrainian armed forces to be ready for combat with Russia. In 2014, Washington helped engineer a coup in Kyiv that overthrew the elected government and installed hand-picked pro-American, anti-Russian successors in its place. The new ultra-nationalist Ukrainian government then banned the use of Russian and other minority languages like Hungarian or Romanian in education or for official business. But almost 30% of Ukrainians are native speakers of Russian. Russian-speaking secessionists in the Donbass region resisted forced assimilation and began a civil war with Ukrainian ultranationalists. This soon became a proxy war between Russia and the West. The United States reaffirmed our intention to bring Ukraine into NATO and stepped up our aid to the Ukrainian armed forces. But if Ukraine were to enter NATO while Crimea was still part of it, the 250-year-old Russian naval base at Sevastopol would fall under the control of the United States and NATO. In large measure to preempt this, Russia annexed Crimea. It was able to do so without violence because Crimeans had made it clear on several previous occasions in referenda that they did not want to be part of Ukraine. In 2014, a Russian-organized referendum revealed that the views of most Crimeans had not changed. If they could not be independent, they preferred to be part of Russia. It is, I think, utterly unrealistic to expect them ever to agree to place themselves once again under Ukrainian sovereignty. By 2021, with our help, Ukraine had acquired a NATO-trained and equipped army larger than the armed forces of Britain, France, and Germany combined. Not surprisingly, Moscow viewed this huge hostile force on its western borders as a serious national security threat. Recent attacks deep into Russia by Ukrainian forces have inadvertently validated Russia's concerns about the consequences of Ukraine joining an alliance hostile to it. Just as Soviet forces stationed in Cuba in 1962 menaced Washington, U.S. forces stationed in Ukraine could reduce the warning time of a strike on Moscow to about 5 minutes. So in December 2021, Moscow massed troops on the Russian border with Ukraine and demanded negotiations to resolve its security concerns. It insisted on Ukrainian neutrality, respect for the rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine, and a discussion of a new European security architecture that would threaten neither Russia nor the members of NATO. The US and NATO responded by rejecting negotiations while warning, in an instance of self-fulfilling paranoia, that Russia planned to invade Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg, NATO Secretary General, put it this way. He said, quote, President Putin sent a draft treaty that they wanted NATO to sign to promise no more NATO enlargement. That was a precondition for Russia not invading Ukraine. Of course, we didn't sign that, unquote. In fact, the US and NATO refused to discuss it at all, leaving Russia with the choice of either accepting NATO membership for Ukraine and the eventual deployment of US forces there, or using force to prevent this. This unwelcome choice was the proximate cause of Moscow's fateful decision to invade Ukraine on February 22, 2022. The Russian invasion of Ukraine was clearly illegal under international law, but to say that it was unprovoked defies credibility. Could a negotiation with Russia have prevented war? we have at least two solid pieces of evidence to suggest that it might have. Despite Moscow's sympathy and support for the Russian-speaking secessionists in the Donbass, it agreed in the Minsk Accords of 2014 and 15 that their region should remain part of Ukraine, provided their linguistic autonomy was guaranteed, much as the case of Quebec, where French is guaranteed to the local inhabitants in the Canadian Federation. The Minsk Accords were, however, subsequently repudiated, not by Russia, but by Ukraine, France, and Germany. Then, too, about 6 weeks after it invaded Ukraine, Moscow actually agreed to a draft treaty with Kyiv by which it would withdraw from Ukraine in return for Ukraine renouncing NATO membership and proclaiming neutrality. This treaty was to have been signed on April 15, 2022, but the US, UK, and NATO objected to it. In early April, Ukraine therefore repudiated its earlier agreement to the terms of the treaty. As the war has groaned on, Russia has repeatedly reiterated its willingness to talk, and the US, NATO, and Ukraine have consistently rejected doing so. The refusal to discuss a formula for peaceful coexistence between Ukraine and Russia, between NATO and Russia, and between Ukrainian and Russian-speaking Ukrainians has had very grave consequences, most of all for Ukraine. The war has not only imposed huge costs on Ukraine, but also greatly weakened its bargaining power in any future negotiation with Russia. If there is an agreed end to this war, it will be on largely Russian terms and vastly less favorable to Ukraine than the peace the US and NATO persuaded Kyiv to reject in April 2022. Ukraine, the US, and NATO are now in the final stages of a humiliating strategic defeat. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the population of Ukraine was about 32 million. Since then, it has fallen to about 20 million. 1/3 of Ukraine's people have been dislocated. Over 2 million have fled to Russia, and 6 to 8 million to the West and elsewhere. The number of Ukrainian casualties is a closely guarded secret, but indications are that it may be around 500,000. Ukraine's industrial base and infrastructure have been devastated. As the war began, Ukraine was the poorest and most corrupt country in Europe. Now it is even poorer and more corrupt. The Biden administration has regularly described the proxy war with Russia as designed to isolate and weaken Russia, and pledged to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, or more recently, as long as we can. Prominent American politicians have extolled the benefits of having Ukrainians rather than Americans die fighting Russians. Ukrainians have done so with remarkable bravery, but so many have died that Ukraine can no longer mount an adequate defense, let alone go on the offensive. The war has devastated Ukraine without either isolating or weakening Russia. It's cut Europe off from Russian energy supplies and reoriented Russia toward China, India, Iran, the West Asian Arab countries, and Africa. Russia's economy has grown, not contracted. Moscow's defense budget has doubled, and its armaments production is now 3 times that of the United States and NATO combined. Like Ukrainian casualties, those of Russia are hard to estimate, but with a population 4 to 5 times larger than Ukraine's, Russia can sustain many more casualties than Ukraine can. The United States and NATO evidently expected an easy victory over Russia, but both now face a humiliating military defeat. The war has greatly weakened Ukraine's bargaining position in any future negotiation with Russia. Germany now feels sufficiently threatened for it to have begun a debate on whether to acquire its own nuclear weapons. As a result of US sanctions and the sabotage of Russia's undersea gas pipeline to Germany, Europe has lost its access to cheap Russian energy supplies. These have been replaced by imports from the United States that are as much as 4 times as expensive. European energy-intensive industries are no longer internationally competitive. Germany, Europe's core economy is being deindustrialized. Current trends raise disturbing questions about the future of the European Union. The Ukraine war, combined with other bellicose actions, has cost the United States and the West the moral argument internationally. We cannot have it both ways, condemning Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine while actively supporting Israel's even more lawless and lethal actions in Palestine. The West has inadvertently put its hypocrisy and double standards on dramatic display. We're told by our leaders and their political strap hangers that Ukraine and other current and potential forever wars are about defending democratic values. But as we build a domestic national security state to support our wars, we are sacrificing ever more of the civil liberties and respect for due process and the rule of law that are central to constitutional democracy. As Benjamin Franklin wisely pointed out, a nation prepared to trade its freedoms for its security puts both in jeopardy. And in this case, it's not even our security that is at stake, but that of others. The domino theory was nonsense in Southeast Asia. It's equally fallacious in Eastern Europe. Our wars are wars of choice, not necessity, and have little or no direct connection to American security and well-being. It's said that U.S. credibility with allies and adversaries is at stake in Ukraine, but our policies and actions there have not bolstered confidence in American steadfastness, so much as shaken confidence in our judgment and cast doubt on the efficacy of our military doctrines and weaponry. The West now suffers from forever war fatigue. American and European taxpayers are becoming reluctant to keep sending money to a cause they increasingly perceive as both futile and corrupt. And as we are being reminded, I think, that as the 20th century demonstrated, there can be no peace in Europe based on ostracizing Russia or any other European great power, like the Weimar Republic in Germany. As the war proceeds, Russia's bargaining position continues to strengthen. If there's ever an end to this war, it will be on terms far less favorable to Ukraine than the peace the US and NATO persuaded it to reject in April 2022. Meanwhile, inept American diplomacy continues to push Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea together in a loose anti-American entente and to increase the danger of one or more nuclear wars. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, basis of NATO, stipulates that, quote, an armed attack against one or more NATO member states in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, unquote. This is an unequivocal commitment to defend any and all NATO members against attack. But the United States and other NATO members have already demonstrated that we are not, in fact, prepared to respond directly to an armed attack on Ukraine by Russia. In response to just such an attack, we have resorted to evasions and a proxy war pitting Ukrainians, but not us, against the aggressor. If Ukraine were a member of NATO, Article 5 would require the president to ask Congress to declare war on the world's most formidable nuclear power. Vladimir Putin has threatened to conduct such a war at the nuclear level. He may not be the demonic figure our propaganda makes him out to be, but bravado aside, calling his bluff is an insane risk for us to take for ourselves, our allies, and the world at large. As in other forever wars, we have inhaled our own propaganda about Ukraine. Our quixotic attempt to exploit Ukrainian nationalism to weaken and isolate Russia or engineer regime change in Moscow has been a catastrophe for Ukrainians and a strategic defeat for the West. It has brought the US and NATO to the point where we must either enter the fray directly, watch Russia grind Ukraine to bits, or accept a negotiated outcome that addresses Russian interests and objectives. Moscow has described those interests and stated those objectives clearly and consistently. They do not include invading NATO territory. Claiming that they do is threat-mongering designed to mobilize popular support in the West for our proxy war in Ukraine, to boost US and NATO defense budgets, and to fatten the profits of the military-industrial complex. Moscow has conducted a limited war, it called it a special military operation deliberately, in Ukraine. It has not marshaled the forces necessary to subdue, occupy, or annex all of Ukraine. Russia's battlefield performance has not demonstrated any capacity to invade the West, and Moscow has expressed no ambition to do so. It is time to stop attributing objectives to Russia that it has not stated and does not have. Moscow's professed aims have been and remain, first, to restore the neutrality of Ukraine and prevent the deployment of US and other NATO forces and installations to Ukraine. Second, to restore and ensure the linguistic and other rights of Ukraine's large Russian-speaking minority. And third, to negotiate a new European security architecture that can alleviate the threat Russia and other European states pose to each other by crafting a durable peace between them. In the absence of diplomacy, the use of force has once again failed. Far from weakening Russia, the Ukraine war has strengthened it. Far from isolating Russia, the Ukraine war has forced it into the embrace of China and Iran and boosted its ties with India, the Arab world, and Africa. Ukraine's economy has been eviscerated, its population reduced, its military capacity gutted, and its territory diminished. If this war is allowed to continue, it will only wreak more havoc in Ukraine, kill more Ukrainians as well as Russians, and further shrink Ukraine's territory, possibly leaving it landlocked. The proponents of our militarized foreign policy asked us once again to give war a chance. We foolishly did. This has now left us with no alternative to trying diplomacy. We cannot hope to regain at the negotiating table what we have lost on the battlefield, but we must now strive to compose a peace with Russia that enables Ukraine to be both a buffer and a bridge between Russia and the rest of Europe. That, not NATO membership, is the prerequisite for the emergence of a prosperous and democratic Ukraine, untainted by corruption. And that, not NATO membership for Ukraine, is the prerequisite for peace and stability in Europe. Thank you.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs is a professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's authored and edited numerous books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers, The End of Poverty, Commonwealth, Economics for a Crowded Planet, and The Price of Civilization. His most recent book is The Age of Globalization, Geography, Technology, and Institutions. Sachs was ranked by The Economist among the top 3 most influential living economists and twice named as one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential world leaders. He's widely recognized for bold and effective strategies to address complex challenges, including the escape from extreme poverty, the global battle against human-induced climate change, international debt and financial crises, national economic reforms, and control of pandemic and epidemic diseases. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, not of me, which was very kind, but of the subject, of the importance of understanding the context and of the aggressiveness of Canada as part of a US-led alliance. Also, I'm delighted to be together with Professor Kachanovsky, whose work I really admire, and he has an important part to tell about this. Just for context, I was on the economic advisory team of President Gorbachev 34 years ago. I was an advisor to President Yeltsin 31 years ago. I was an advisor to Ukraine's President Kuchma 30 years ago. I was an advisor to President Yushchenko about 27 years ago. I know this story from the beginning. This is a story about NATO expansion. And this is a story that you will not read in the mainstream media. This is a story that the US government works overtime to hide and to dissemble. And this is most unfortunate. Most governments don't tell the truth about anything anymore, but I wait for the United States to tell the truth about anything anymore, because I do not believe anything that comes out of Washington these days about this war and much else, unfortunately. Sad to say, this is a war that could readily have been avoided at so many times, because first the Soviet Union and then leaders of Russia said over and over again, do not expand NATO to Ukraine. Is this such a hard concept to grasp? I think we should just contemplate if Mexico and China make a military alliance, the United States is not going to say, and Prime Minister Trudeau is not going to say, well, that's their choice. It's an open door. They can do what they want. That's pretense or arrogance. I don't know which for sure. But the United States has said, we don't care what Russia says about what we do. And it is formal NATO policy, stated repeatedly, our decisions of where we go cannot be influenced by third countries, period. So NATO assumes that it can move to anybody's border without complaint or response. If you want to know why this war occurred, that's it. That's the one sentence explanation. The rest is details. And of course, people will say, oh, that's so wrong, Professor Sachs. What happened to you? Are you crazy? Because that's what I hear from people who read the New York Times each day, because that's what they're fed. Because we're fed stories. I'm sorry, I was there at these instances. I was actually there. Professor Kachanovsky is the world expert on what happened at the Maidan. I was there the day after because I was asked to be there by the next government, and it was explained to me how the US NGOs, so-called, funded the protests on the Maidan, paid for it. Oh, we'd feel great if the Chinese paid for the January 6th demonstrations in Washington. We'd say, oh, that's just fine. Well, the United States paid for the Maidan, but you won't read about it in the New York Times. So, okay, we live in a world of lies, and the United States is run by confidentiality, except when somebody leaks stuff. But everything is supposed to be secret. So let's just disentangle for a few minutes what actually happened. What actually happened is that starting in 1989 and 1990, the United States and Germany repeatedly, explicitly represented to Gorbachev that NATO will not move 1 inch eastward towards the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union disbands the Warsaw Pact. And you can go on the National Security Archives of George Washington University. The article is called What Gorbachev Heard. And just look at it online. You'll find about 30 archival documents that tell the truth. So the US promised no NATO enlargement. And you know what? I'll tell you a secret among the 427 of us. The United States lied. Because already starting in 1992, there were full plans for NATO enlargement, including, by the way, Ukraine as early as 1992. I recently spoke with a leading historian who's working through archival materials. He explained to me Ukraine was on the list already in 1992. Because the US is arrogant. I'm sorry to tell you another secret, if we can just keep it among ourselves. The US believes it runs the world. It's the sole superpower. And it can do what it wants. And because of American values, we can do whatever we want. Whether it's subversive operations, overthrowing governments, launching wars on false pretenses, bombing Belgrade, bombing Libya, doesn't matter. But don't expect to get the straight story, because you won't. Starting in the mid-1990s, there was already a detailed account of what the timeline would be. If I can pull up an article, I'll try while we're talking. I just want to quote to you from Zbigniew Brzezinski, who laid out in a foreign affairs article, which is a kind of way that the insiders explain to the New York elite what's really going on. And he wrote already exactly the game plan. And I think it's just funny to read it. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so here's Brzezinski writing in 1997, September-October issue of Foreign Affairs. He says, quote, "Accordingly, NATO and EU enlargement should move forward in deliberate stages. Assuming a sustained American and Western European commitment, here is a speculative but realistic timetable for these stages. By 1999, the first 3 Central European members will have been admitted into NATO. By that he means Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic. Although their inclusion in the EU will probably not take place before 2002 or 2003. It was 2004. By 2003, the EU is likely to have initiated accession talks with all 3 Baltic republics. And NATO will likewise have moved forward on their membership as well as that of Romania and Bulgaria, with their accession likely to be completed before 2005. Check the box. Between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, provided it has made significant domestic reforms and has become identified as Central European country, should also be ready for initial negotiations with the EU and NATO. It happened in 2008. In other words, Brzezinski's not speculating. Brzezinski's telling you the plan, and he's laying out what is going to happen. Well, this plan did not sit well with the Russians. They said, no, do not move NATO to our nearly 2,000-kilometer border with Ukraine. Do not do it. The United States is deaf. So first came the first 3 expansions, and then, as you heard, there were 7 under George W. Bush, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Then in 2008, okay, drum roll, the US insists that Ukraine and Georgia will be members. And if you look at a map, all they're doing is playing out Brzezinski's plan to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Because with Ukraine and Georgia, you have Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia completely surrounding Russia in the Black Sea. That's the plan. It's not even subtle. So Putin said in 2007, look, we want to cooperate, we're trying to cooperate, but don't keep expanding NATO, because you said not 1 inch eastward, and now you have, it's 10 countries, and now it's going to be 12, and then it's going to be 14, and you're surrounding us. Okay, again, the United States didn't listen. But there was bad luck for the US, which is the Ukrainian people did not want NATO expansion. If you look at the opinion surveys, and just go on Wikipedia to take a look, because they're all collated in Wikipedia, the surveys at each date, about 10 surveys, large majorities against NATO enlargement. And President Viktor Yanukovych was elected and became president in 2010, and he pushed for Ukraine's neutrality. And he pushed for Russia to have a long-term lease till 2042 in Sevastopol and the Black Sea region, where the Russian fleet has been based since 1783. That's a good reason to overthrow him, which is what the US policy became by the end of 2013. So when protests broke out over Yanukovych's delay in signing an EU accession agreement, and whether those protests were originally provoked or originally spontaneous, I'll leave it to Professor Kachanovsky to help us understand. But soon they were militarized and paramilitarized by really violent groups, especially from Western Ukraine. And we know from a taped intercept on February 6th, 2014, Victoria Nuland discussing who the next government is going to be 2 weeks later. And she describes on the tape her partners back in Washington. Who are they? The Veep, that's Joe Biden, and the Veep's national security advisor, that's Jake Sullivan. So the team is the same team as in power right now that played the overthrow of Yanukovych. Now, when the overthrow occurred, I got a call, oh, come to Kiev and meet the new government. And when a government asks, I went. And when I went, the Maidan was still swirling with people, and a US person explained to me, oh, how the US, they were so proud how the US had helped finance these demonstrations. This was an NGO explaining how much money they had put into financing the demonstrations. It made me sick, by the way, to know this, the contrivance and the role of the United States in the overthrow. Okay, we're not allowed to talk about any of that, so please keep this to ourselves. It's just 467 of us. But you will not read about this at all. Then we know the war broke out, not in February 2022, the war broke out in February 2014. And again, Professor Kachanovsky is by far the authority on what happened in Odessa, what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass. But already this was civil war, and already by 2015, NATO was pouring in weapons. And there was a UN-backed attempt at peace, especially the Minsk II agreement, and supposedly co-guaranteed by France and Germany. And the Ukrainians brazenly, this new Ukrainian US NATO-backed government just said, we're not implementing that. So they signed it, they didn't implement it. Angela Merkel said a few months ago in a quite notorious interview, oh, no, it was just to buy time for Ukraine so it could strengthen itself. Well, billions of dollars of weapons went in. Biden came into office, and Putin put forward a draft security agreement in December 2021 that was to be an agreement between NATO and Russia on security arrangements, calling for, at the center, stopping the enlargement. I spoke to White House officials, a senior White House official at the end of 2021. I said, avoid the war, for heaven's sake, stop the NATO enlargement. Do you get it? This has been the issue all along. And I was told, never, we will never negotiate over that issue. NATO has a, quote, open door, just like I'm sure we'd say with Mexico if it allies with China. I can't say the real word that applies to this because it's not in polite company, but this is not grown-up behavior. This is provocation of war. So in the middle of January 2022, the US formally rejected any discussion about NATO enlargement. And if you read the minutes of Russia's National Security Council meeting on the eve of the invasion, and the meeting took place, I believe it was the 21st of February, you can see all the statements. They're all about NATO. Putin opens, he says, we tried to stop NATO enlargement, but they weren't serious, and the United States is without any credibility whatsoever. And then Lavrov speaks next, and he describes the negotiating process and how it failed, and that the NATO countries were unwilling to discuss the disposition of NATO. Okay, that's the war. The war broke out. Within a month, Zelensky said, you know, maybe we could be neutral. And negotiations started in Ankara with Turkish mediation. And I spoke to the Turkish mediators. I spoke to people who were deeply involved in this. There was rapid progress made on the basis of Ukrainian neutrality. Then, one day, the Ukrainians showed up and said, no, we're taking a pause from the negotiations. The best estimate given to us by former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett in a very interesting long interview that he gave online a couple of months ago said, yeah, the US stopped it. He said, I didn't agree with them, but they thought that they needed to be tough towards China, that it would be a sign of weakness to go along with this. Honest to God. Honestly, it's worse than 5-year-olds. And so the war continued, the negotiations ended, we've had another year. They don't care about the lives lost in Washington. They don't care. Even Romney wrote an article saying this war is great. Russia is losing, Russia's being bled, and not one American life is being lost. He actually had the stupidity to write that, or the evil to write that. Okay, that's the story. If we want this war to end, we got to negotiate, and it's got to be based on no NATO enlargement. There is no other way this war will end. Why? Because if Ukraine is victorious on the battlefield, Russia will use nuclear weapons. And if Ukraine fails on the battlefield, well, the whole thing's moot. And the third option is the war goes on forever, which is American-style wars. Yeah, sure, we can just fight forever.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson is a retired colonel of the United States Army, where he served for over 31 years. After he retired from the Army, he also had an extensive, impressive, significant career in the government, where he held many positions, including special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and perhaps what he's best known for as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell, who was his friend and mentor. Colonel Wilkerson also taught at the College of William and Mary and George Washington University. So it's my honor to welcome Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
And let me start with Ukraine for just a minute or two. Back to that sketch I gave you, but not very far, back to the end of the Cold War. I was there with my boss. He was there with Ronald Reagan when he was National Security Advisor to Ronald Reagan, his last one, and then the deputy before that. So 2 years with Reagan. And those 2 years were also with H.W. Bush, who was then the vice president for 8 years for Ronald Reagan. He was there in St. Catherine's Palace with Gorbachev. He was there on Long Island with H.W. Bush, Reagan, and Gorbachev. He was there with Shevardnadze when they did this. Shevardnadze was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union / Russia at that time. Really Mikhail Gorbachev's right-hand man. We were all there when we said, in essence, hey, this is a really special moment. And Gorbachev was a special creature in that moment. We're going to take advantage of this. And Bush said, we are not going to beat our chests. That was his exact words. We are not going to beat our chests. We're not going to trumpet our victory. We're not going to step on them with track shoes. We're going to establish some sort of regime, he called it the New World Order, in the world, that will live up to the very standards we put in the UN Charter. That's what we're going to try to do. And Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany, a brilliant man, Francois Mitterrand in France, Maggie Thatcher and John Major in England, and others, were on the phone every day trying to discuss what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. When Helmut Kohl was told that maybe he could reunify Germany, he was stunned. He didn't know whether he wanted to. Smart man. First of all, it was going to cost, by their own estimates, 80 billion US. It wound up costing about 200 billion US. But that was the projection at that time, and that was really formidable from Bonn's perspective, West Germany's perspective. Then when he was told that Gorbachev would probably let him stay in NATO if he reunified, he was thunderstruck. He couldn't believe it. And initially, he was against it. Why? Because he knew that Moscow's vibes would be a little negative, no matter what Gorbachev said. He has to live with that 11 time zone country. And so he was a little bit concerned. He wanted to do it. He wanted to be the chancellor who reunified Germany, and he wanted to stay in NATO, but really uneasy about it. H.W. Bush took care of that unease, and so did Mikhail Gorbachev. And Francois Mitterrand came right along too. One of the reasons was because both Jim Baker, H.W.'s Secretary of State, and H.W. himself told Gorbachev, if all of this comes to pass, NATO will not move 1 inch further east. Now, today, Bill Clinton and a host of other neophyte asses have essentially said that was just a spoken word, and that's not sealing. You know, gentlemen's words are not treaties. That's right out of Bill Clinton's mouth, as a matter of fact. Well, I'm sorry. That's not the world I grew up in. The world I grew up in is your word is your bond, whether you're a diplomat, a president, or whatever. Well, so we just violated that, and we've been violating it ever since. Anatoly Chubai and Larry Summers, you've heard that name before, I'm sure, raped, pillaged, and plundered Moscow with fire sales of all the old Soviet Union hard assets to the oligarchs. And the fees they gained off of that increased, for example, Harvard's endowment by about $19.6 billion overnight. Was Larry Summers really fired because he made some impolitic remarks about women in science? Or was he fired because Harvard figured out where the money came from? Didn't give it back, of course. Russia, in other words, has no reason to believe or respect or to have anything to do with Washington. And Putin tried, and I have no love for Vladimir Putin, but he tried time and time again to prevent having to use troops in Ukraine. He even gave us a dramatic example. My president, George W. Bush, neophyte par excellence, went to Tbilisi, and standing beside that young president, Saakashvili, who is now mayor of Odessa, show you how Georgians get around, stood right there beside him in the public square and said Georgia would be a member of NATO in the future. What did Putin do? He invaded, took the two western oblast, for all practical purposes. Still some Russian troops there. What would we think he'd do with Ukraine? Much, much, much more strategic. Of course, he's going to invade. But this time he decided, I think, he was going to teach us a little bit of a lesson. And he really didn't invade to take Kyiv. He didn't invade to do anything, but to teach those Johnny-come-latelys in Kyiv, who were being backed to the hilt by us and had been since 2002. I was there, remember? Didn't leave the State Department until 2005. I was there with Timoshenko and Yevtushenko and all those criminals, because that's what they were. Yulia Tymoshenko was even that. We had been fomenting the situation in Ukraine since at least 2002, and big time since 2006 and 7, when the European commander, 4-star Air Force General Philip Breedlove, used to get on his Harley, yes, and ride down the Autobahns and on down into Ukraine and talk with the Azov Battalion and others like that. We have been in Ukraine fomenting all manner of unrest to get at Russia. Weak, very weak. We can take them on. We can take them on. So all the neoconservatives came out of the woodwork. Okay, let's finish Russia off before we do China. And Ukraine was the way we were going to do it. Wrong, people. Wrong. You misjudge, misestimated George W. Bush. Russia. Yeah, Russia lost in 1917. Had a lot of other things going on, though, in World War I. Oh, yeah, well, Russia's been beaten before, you know, blah, blah, blah. I've heard all the arguments. 11 time zones. You don't go to war with a country of 150 million people of 11 time zones, the strategic depth like no other country in the world, with roughly 38 million in Ukraine. You just don't do it. Even if you've got NATO behind you, you don't have anything but their arms behind you and their money. That's not going to beat the Russians. So now we're in a mess, complete mess. They have lost. They have lost so badly. If you're familiar with von Clausewitz and his Vom Krieg on war, you understand that war has its own dynamic. And every day that dynamic changes. Well, right now, the Russian military and Putin are looking at the dynamic favoring them, which says, why stop now? They didn't want all of Ukraine. What would he want with all of Ukraine? He'd have a guerrilla war on his hands. If you've not looked at Napoleon and how the Ukrainian partisans fell on him, or you haven't looked at the Nazis, or for that matter, the Russians themselves, whom the Ukrainian partisans fell on, they didn't give a hoot who you were, communist, Marxist, capitalist, or whatever. They're bloody-minded people. They would fall on you and kill you and take your gold teeth. And that's what we're talking about. That's really what we're talking about. It hasn't changed a whole lot. He didn't want that. All he wanted was a little bit of control over those portions of Ukraine where dominant Russian populations existed and were being treated very terribly. And he was right. They were. As Ukraine's leadership changed, the pendulum swung one way and the other. But a lot of that pendulum was being pushed by us and by the British. Oh, don't let me forget perfidious Albion. I don't even recognize London anymore. I don't even recognize the British people anymore. They're right in there, in for a penny, in for a pound. I'm going to put some troops into. Oh, do you know your military is about as big as a battalion of the American military? The British military is so small, you could put it in Ukraine, it'd be subsumed in 15 minutes. So where are we there? We're at a point where they have lost, and we're killing people still, even though they've lost. And we have a leader in Zelensky who's courageous, valorous, brave, use all the adjectives you want to, but hasn't a clue how to get out of this. So he's got to go. Got to have somebody in there who's interested in the future of Ukraine. And he's got to have somebody in Washington that backs that. Won't happen until the election's over, because Joe Biden has been told by his advisors, and I think Joe himself thinks, and I've known him for a long time, that he can't get reelected if he's seen as cutting and running. So he's going to do an LBJ. LBJ knew that George Ball was right. He knew that he couldn't win in Vietnam. Quote from LBJ, a quote, a direct quote, "Oh ho ain't going to be moved by no bombs." This is when he's being told by the Air Force that he should kill 2.5 million Vietnamese with more iron bombs than we dropped in World War II on Germany. Why? And 30,000 more names on that big black marble wall down in Washington. Why? Because I don't want to be seen as cutting and running. Prestige, what Dean Acheson called the shadow of power. Prestige. A lot of things wrapped up in that word with Joe Biden and Ukraine, too. Don't want to be proved so blatantly wrong. That's where we are in Ukraine.